fields, from biology and anthropology to psychology and religious studies. And most recently, he's focused on community development. Dr. Wilson is also one of the great popularizers of evolution of our day. He's written 4 books and edited the 5th on evolution and evolutionary interpretations of phenomena in fields as disparate as religious studies, altruism, literature, community development, and sort of as well as general evolutionary topics. He maintains an active online community at thisviewoflife.com, which covers religious, evolutionary perspectives on that same breadth of topics and more. Dr. Wilson has also been a leader in expanding the use of evolutionary theory in society beyond the ivory tower. He started a successful interdisciplinary undergraduate certificate of evolutionary studies that is started at Binghamton and is now spreading to campuses across the U.S. as well as internationally, and has founded the first evolutionary think tank called the Evolution Institute. The reason that Dr. Wilson is with us today is due to his recent effort focused on community development. And this is an effort to reach outside, beyond the ivory tower, called the Binghamton Neighborhood Project. And he's recently published a book called The Neighborhood Project, Using Evolution to Improve My City One Block at a Time. He was recently interviewed on National Public Radio for this innovative sort of community-based research. And so I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Dr. David Wilson on his talk, Using Evolution to Improve the Quality of Life.
Awesome to be here and to be speaking to a group that includes a sustainability group. So very eager to get started. Now let me ask you, how many people need to leave at one? How much? And so what I'm going to do, I don't want to rush through my talk. I have a lot that I want to tell you about. And so I'm going to take my time, and if I'm not quite done at 1, what I'm going to do is just break a little bit before 1. We could have a few minutes of questions before then. People who need to make their escape can do that. And then I can finish up with the people that can stay a little bit longer. Maybe I will get done by 1, but I just don't want to have to speak like an auctioneer, basically, in order to say what I have to say. So I'd like to talk about 3 waves of evolutionary thought. The first wave is the one we all know. It's a theory that is organized in biological sciences. Almost all colleges and universities around the world, evolution is taught as a biological topic. If you're not a biology major, you're unlikely to know much about evolution. And I think it worth reflecting upon. How many people in this room are biologists? Hey, about half. And so what you know and what others might not know, what it means for there to be a single theory that can apply to the length and breadth of the study of life. I was just talking to, on the way over here, with some of the people that I've been talking with, but what a delight it is to be an evolutionary biologist and to be able to enter into a conversation on any species, any trait, and to be speaking the same language. It might be a bird, a reptile, an amoeba. It might be foraging behavior, sexual behavior, or some molecular mechanism. All approaching all of these questions with the same toolkit, some conceptual and empirical, theoretical empirical toolkit is enabling us to study all of those different subjects. And so that is a kind of an interdisciplinarity which already exists among evolutionary biologists. And if we can stretch that interdisciplinarity to include the study of our own species, we want to do it. That's what we want to know about. Because for those of you in the audience who are trained in a human-related discipline, that might be economics or anthropology or sociology or psychology, all of which exist in many flavors, then you do not have that kind of interdisciplinarity. And that's why we have so many human-related departments on a college campus, and then we worry about the silo problem, and that although we want interdisciplinarity, that's as American as apple pie, we find it so hard to achieve, and for those who achieve it, it's hard to get a job. So interdisciplinarity is something which happens spontaneously within the biological sciences and still in progress, as I'll actually like to emphasize, but which does not take place spontaneously in the human. If we can change that, and if we can stretch that kind of interdisciplinarity, we definitely want to do so. And so the second wave is just that, is that basically, can we expand evolution beyond the biological sciences to include all things human? And it's so interesting to remember, that's how Darwin thought it, and Wallace thought it. They thought of humans along with all other species from this perspective. Darwin was studying human morality and the expression of emotions and humans at the very same time that he was studying barnacle and orchid. But something happened in the history of evolutionary thought that caused that to basically cause evolution to become restricted, utterly restricted to the biological sciences, and mostly avoided for human-related subjects, especially human-related subjects that have to do with human behavior and culture. And we know what that was. It was social Darwinism. It was seeing evolution through the lens of Victorian culture. Evolution was rejected for good reasons back then because of those particular formulations. But the bottom line is that for most human-related disciplines, have developed into very complex bodies of thought and knowledge without explicit reference to evolution since before most of the current experts were born. And so what do we do with these disciplines? Very sophisticated in their own rights, no doubt correct in many respects, have not been explicitly related to evolution. It's only been in the last 20 years or so that there's been a renewed effort to rethink if rethinking is necessary, because in many cases it could result in the reinvention of the wheel. That happens. Okay, well, what does it mean to rethink the human-related disciplines from an evolutionary perspective? And that is something which is now in progress as far as science and scholarship is concerned, not future science, not fringe science. In progress, just open the pages of Science, Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and all the specialized journals, and you will see humanity approach from an evolutionary perspective. Not yet reflected in higher education, so there's big time lag with respect to how much of this is represented. As you might expect, since so many of the experts did not have evolution in their own higher education. And so one reason that I felt it was important to create a interdisciplinary teaching evolution across the curriculum in a university is to solve exactly that problem. So EBOS is intended to solve that problem. But in any case, the second wave of evolutionary thinking is in progress. And I think historians will look back and they'll see the 21st century will be a period of coalescence on the study of humans is comparable to the coalescence that took place in the 20th century in biology and is still continuing. That's how we'll look back on it. Well, the third way is to take this knowledge and to apply it to everyday life. And that, of course, is still more recent. So whatever time lags exist in higher education, those time lags are still greater when it comes to using evolution as a practical tool for solving all of the problems of our existence. And in just the same way that you can use evolution to study any trait in any species, theoretically it's possible that you could use the same theory to look at any policy issue in humans. If it lives and breathes, we can study it from an evolutionary perspective. So it might be education, it might be health, it might be anything at any scale, from neighborhood to the global village. Potentially we can study with this same toolkit. And so that is still more in the future. And it's been my adventure over the last 5 or 6 years now, both locally, using my city as a field site. So Jane Goodall has her chimps, Darwin had his finches, and I have the city of Binghamton. Binghamton is my field site for studying all things human from an evolutionary perspective, both basic science and applied. And that turns out to be a new model for community-based research. It was business as usual for someone trained as an evolutionary ecologist. I got my training in zooplankton ecology. It was business as usual for an evolutionary ecologist. Turns out to be a new model for community-based research. And then to more broadly formulate public policy, the Evolution Institute, for serving basically as a conduit for from the world of evolutionary scientists to the world of public policy on any topics. Some of the topics we've considered are education, risky adolescent behavior, quality of life, nation building in failed states. That's just a sample of some of the topics that we've been dealing with. Well, this is a group that's studying sustainability, and so I wanted to make the sustainability connection as strongly here at the beginning. In Binghamton, we're just starting to move into sustainability issues, urban ecosystems and this sort of thing. So we're a couple of years behind you in this respect. Our initial focus for the Binghamton Neighborhood projects were more purely human-centered topics, such as, for example, pro-sociality, neighborhood safety, how to make the school system work, something like more purely human-centered, as opposed to something that's centered more in the interface between human activity and natural activities. But of course, in my career, I've just been just as much as a biologist, and so I'm happy to actually round out our own programs for it. So any group that's ambitiously studying sustainability is going to have these elements. There's going to be an element of species-level ecology. People studying single species, either in a natural environment or in an altered anthropogenic environment. And those folks will be thoroughly evolutionary. You cannot study a single species without understanding its properties as a product of evolution, either operating over the long term, giving it its properties which are now unchanging over the short time scale, or, and this is a relatively recent revelation over the last 20 or 30 years, is that, you know what's coming, some of you do, evolution operates on ecological time scales. And so evolution is not a slow process that operates over thousands of generations, giving us species that are unchanging in their current properties. A single generation can result in the properties of the species changing before your eyes. And the selection forces that are causing that rapid evolution are often human-caused and genetic forces. And so when we study non-human species, we study them at two time scales. One is the long-term evolutionary time scales that gave them their property, and then the current time scale of evolution, often operating with a vengeance. Okay? So those are the folks in this room that are thoroughly imbued with evolution. Now, we're also, a group such as this is going to be studying nature at a larger scale. It's inherent in sustainability that we need to be studying nature at large spatial and temporal scales. That would be ecosystems or landscapes, even a landscape as large as the state of Maine. And historically, the study of nature at a large scale was not evolutionary. So ecosystem ecology as a discipline developed around a different set of concepts, such as energy flows, nutrient cycling, trophic levels, in which, of course, it was species that made these things up, but there was not close attention on particular species, other than the broad category. And we can sympathize with why the field developed in that way, because it's just a constraint that if you're studying any system at a large scale, then just to keep it manageable, you have to simplify somewhere, and often that takes the form of black boxing the components that make up that species. And we know that we can study gases without studying each and every molecule. But as it's turned out, the experience has been within that field that ecosystems are not like that. A species is not like a molecule. And often you cannot understand the large-scale processes of a large-scale system without understanding them as composed of species that are themselves employing strategies of survival and reproduction. That is going to govern the properties of the ecosystem. And so the fact that we're studying nature at a large spatial and temporal scale, it turns out, does not exempt us from being evolutionists as we go about it. And what I just said about fast-paced evolutionary processing goes for ecosystem processing as much as other processes. One of many examples I could give is the work of Tom Widow, who shows that he's at Northern Arizona University, and he shows that within a single species of tree, there can be actually orders of magnitudes of difference in the degree to which individuals are protected by toxins. And when beavers move into our ecosystem, because they're optimal foragers, they're adapted to eat the palatable trees, not the unpalatable trees. And without changing the species composition of the ecosystem at all, just simply removing the palatable individuals from the unpalatable individuals, you now have much more toxic trees. And then that's going to percolate through the entire ecosystem in terms of the rate of decomposition, the species that can tolerate everything can take place on the basis of the individual decision-making behavior of a particular keystone species, operating on individual differences within other species. So you simply cannot understand an ecosystem without understanding it from this evolutionary perspective. And finally, sometimes the ecosystem itself, or a community itself, could be a unit of selection in which what's being selected is the whole ecosystem. And the species become a little bit more like genes. It's kind of a foreign concept when you're selecting for a higher level unit, such as a group or an ecosystem, that you're actually selecting for functional organization at a level above the individual. And of course, that's going to become one of the main things that I talk about. So all of that's within biology. Now we get into the human stuff. We get to what NSF likes to call coupled natural and human systems, the interface between human activities and biological activities. We have all the human welfare issues that we have to pay attention to. We hope sustainability includes human sustainability in addition to natural sustainability. So something about making, for example, a neighborhood work well or a school or a business work well, that should be part of sustainability. We have issues of human governance, and how do we make a government work well at any scale, a city, a county, a state, a nation, the world. These are all issues, so inherently interdisciplinary, inherently oriented towards welfare over the long term. If you're studying sustainability, you have no recourse. It's your lot. It sucks for you. But you have to study. You have to try to make society work well over the long term, just by definition, and at all scales, small plus large. And so interdisciplinary is forced upon us. And what's new, basically, is that what's business as usual here, and it's just been happening here over the last 10 or 20 years, all of a sudden it can be used for the whole electric grid, the whole, yeah. And so if that's possible, we want to know about it. Maybe it's not possible, so I have to have pushback on that. But if we can do that, we want to know about it, because that would be a game changer in terms of our ability to solve understand and solve our problems. So against that background, I want to provide a little evolutionary sampler for you today. I definitely need to tell you about multi-level selection, because it's a very basic aspect of evolution that applies equally to human and non-human species, equally relevant to biology and humans. And I need to tell you a little bit about major evolutionary transitions, which is a part of multi-level selection theory, and which accounts for how occasionally, not often, but occasionally, a group can become so cooperative that it turns into a higher level superorganism in its own right. This is called ultrasociality. Most social species are not like this. They're social, they exist in groups, but when you look at how those groups work, you realize actually they're not functioning all that well as groups. To some extent, but not to other extent. And a major transition shifts them so much in the direction of cooperativity that the group functions highly cooperative unit in most respects and literally becomes a super organism. You are such a group, and I am such a group. Actually, we're groups of groups of groups. And so this concept of major evolutionary transition is something which is actually pretty new within biology. And now we're just beginning to realize that human evolution is an example of a major transition. We are an ultra-cooperative species, especially at the scale of small groups. But then, thanks to cultural evolution, the scale of functional human social organization has been increasing over the course of human history, leading to our current state today. So major evolutionary transitions in the concept of ultra-sociality applied to our own species is a major concept. It's just new within the last 20 years, for sure. So all of that is sort of the basic scientific end of things. And then, if I have time, of course I will have time, to turn practical now, that third wave, and how can we take this knowledge and actually use it to improve the performance of groups at two scales? One is the small scale of face-to-face groups of people that know each other. How can we get them to work better? And then expanding that scale as we must in order to achieve functional organization. I'm really happy I made the decision to go slow so that I don't feel like I have to just talk like I can. Okay, so here's a little tutorial on the concept of multi-level selection, a simple subject of a complex history. Here's 3 adaptations that are individually advantageous. The sharp teeth of the tiger, the bird, the polar bear, the well-camouflaged lizard. And what you need to know about these adaptations is that they increase the survival and reproduction of individuals compared to other individuals in their immediate vicinity. And so if you take a polar bear with thick fur and you put it right next to one with thin fur, it's the one with thick fur that has more babies. And so it evolves by the process of natural selection. That was Darwin's theory of natural selection at the individual level. There's some more adaptations, but these are social adaptations. We have the meerkats that are expanding centuries. We have the termites that build this amazing physical structure. We have microbes that are social. So it actually hasn't been that long since we've appreciated that microbes are actually typically social. It used to be they studied microbes in batch liquid culture, but now we know that most microbes are just in biofilms, and these biofilms are groups of microbes. And then, of course, we have human examples such as these heroic firefighters. And if you look at what makes a group function well, what you find is that those traits, and altruism is the paradigmatic example. Of altruism, I do something good for you at my expense. Okay? And the puzzle of altruism is that it's locally disadvantageous. Unlike the polar bear with the thick fur standing next to the one with thin fur, if you stand an altruist next to a selfish individual, who survives and reproduces better? It's the selfish individual. And so this is not just for altruism, but on any public good. What's the good need to work? Who does it? That's going to take time, energy, and risk on the part of individuals, which are definition shared by individuals who do not necessarily bear that same cost. So this goes way, way beyond altruism. There are many traits that you would not associate with altruism that are subject to this same problem. And the reason that this is so fundamental is that it's a basic matter of trade-offs. We all know about trade-offs. Any tool is designed for one purpose. It's klutzy. It tends to be klutzy for other purposes. So try using a can opener for anything other than opening cans. And it's not going to work that well. And so if you design me an organism that's designed to maximize its relative fitness within the group, think of a person whose only purpose in life is to do better than the other people in its group. It does not care how it does, or its group does. It only cares about doing better than other members of its group. That creature will be very different than another creature that you might design that is built and designed to work with other individuals because the group will do well as a functional unit. It is simply a matter of trade-off. What that means is that there is the occasional trait that works well. So this is a statistical thing. But in general terms, there's no way that the traits that increase relative fitness within the group are the very same ones that cause the group to do well as a group. So the folktale is a man who granted a single wish by a genie subject to the constraint that his neighbor will get double. I'm going to ask you, which part of the world do you think this folktale comes from? Put out one of my eyes, he said. That is the logic of relative fitness. The one-eyed man is the king in the valley of the wine. And if you were intent on maximizing your relative fitness, you would wish that one of their eyes be put out as long as your neighbor gets double. That comes from the nation of Bulgaria. And there's certain regions of the world that are black holes when it comes to cooperation. Reasons that are quite interesting in terms of the history, the cultural history of those species. And so this leads to a fundamental problem that Darwin perceived. Darwin saw this very clearly. How can the good of the group traits evolve in a population when they are locally disadvantageous to each individual? From an evolutionary perspective, how can you possibly explain how something evolved when in each and every group where it is present at the time, it is actually being actively selected against? So it's a problem that has a solution, and that solution is a partial solution. Here's the solution, and this is all very simple. All of you can wrap your head around this. This is not like the theory of relativity. This is simple. Okay? So, the reason that these traits can evolve is because they're advantageous at a larger scale. It's true that the altruist is less fit than the selfish individual within the group. It is equally true that a group of altruists is more fit than a group of selfish individuals. And so if we can add a layer to the process of natural selection, so natural selection consists of the different survival and reproduction of groups, in addition to the differential survival and reproduction of individuals within groups, then we have identified an evolutionary force that can explain how groups can evolve as an adaptive unit. It is group level selection. And the reason that the solution is only partial is because not only must there be a process of group level selection, but it must be sufficiently strong to counteract selection against the very same trait within groups. And that might or might not be happening. So you need group selection, and group selection must be sufficiently strong to counteract selection within our groups. And so I have succeeded in explaining to you the concept of multi-level selection. The long version is in this paper I wrote with the other Wilson. And at the end of the paper, we summarize it. The 1-foot version, you all might remember that Rabbi Hillel was asked to explain the Torah standing on 1 foot. And here's our 1-foot version. Selfishness beats altruism within single groups. Altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Everything else is commentary. Everything else that you might want to know about the evolution of social behavior is commentary. So here's another way of putting it. Since it should be in every textbook. And with that picture, what an interesting picture that is. Look at that. There's the mortar, there's the rod. I mean, very interesting imagery. So this is truly something that we all need to know, and it applies with equal force to all human social situations in addition to biological situations. Adaptation at any level of a multi-tier hierarchy requires a process of selection at the same level and is often undermined by selection at lower levels. Selfish genes can undermine the individual organism. Selfish organisms can undermine the group. Selfish kin groups, nepotism, can undermine the higher level politics. Selfish corporations can undermine the nation. Selfish nations can undermine the global village. It is humbling to think that as we strive to create functional organization at large spatial and temporal scales, which is what we are trying to do in sustainability, there's some sense in which we must be selective at that scale. And if we're selecting at lower scales,
that's going to be part of the problem, not necessarily part of the solution. That is very, very humbling. So the message here, if I stop my lecture here, and if you took this message seriously, then my job would be about 70% done. To absorb this message of multi-level selection. Now I have to spend just a little bit of time on the history, as little as possible, because how is it possible that such a simple idea can be so controversial and remain so controversial? It's so simple. And what happened in the 1960s was a consensus forum based largely on this man, Bert Williams, and his classic book, Adaptation and Natural Selection, which in the first place affirmed what I've been talking about, this problem and its solution. Okay, so what Williams did was he brought it to everyone's attention, this problem that Darwin also knew about. The fact is that natural selection is based on relative fitness, creates the good of the group, so this is what I've been saying. And in order to get group level adaptations, you need group level selection. The additional thing that Williams did was this bold part here, was the empirical point that even though group level adaptations can evolve in principle, they seldom evolve in reality, because it's simply with an empirical claim. When you consulted the data, you were forced to conclude that lower level selection was invariably stronger than higher level selection. And so group selection simply doesn't happen, even though it could happen in principle. And if group selection doesn't work, then we need other theories that do work. And so at that time in the 1960s, we have other theories that evolved, that emerged to explain the evolution of altruistic and apparently altruistic behavior. And those of you that are biologists know that was inclusive fitness theory, also called kin selection, simple altruism, selfish gene theory. All of these were developed as ways to explain the evolution of social behavior without invoking group selection. And what has emerged since then, and I think it does deserve to be called a consensus at this point, at least among the cognoscenti, is this. That first part is impeccable. Nothing is wrong with the reasoning that I've given to you, and which was also part of the 1960s consensus. What's changed is that it's simply not the case that you can make a categorical statement that lower level selection invariably trumps higher level selection. It is simply the case of opposing selective forces, and sometimes it tips one way, other times it tips the other way. But that the only thing you can do is to study multi-level selection on a case-by-case basis and let the chips fall where they may. Categorical statements, and in retrospect, we can look back. What other subject in biology, major subject in biology, can you make a categorical statement like that? Can you say predation is always more important than competition, or drift is always more important than selection? Or no. It's always, when it's a matter of opposing forces, then of course it's going to tip one way or another. So that's one of the things that we've decided. And another thing that we've learned is that there's other theories of social behavior that were developed as alternatives to group selection. In fact, have the logic of multi-level selection within their own frameworks. And so I invite you, if you're a biologist who studies social behavior, just consult whatever theory you're using. It doesn't matter what its name is. And you will find that your model or your system or whatever, it involves multiple groups. It must, because that's a fact of biological life. It's simply the case that social behaviors are expressed among sets of individuals that are small compared to the total population. And so evolution takes place in multiple groups of population, almost always. And when you examine the traits that are labeled cooperative or selfish or whatever, just see for yourself in those models or in those actual empirical systems, those traits are locally disadvantageous. Look at any cooperative trait in the game theory model, look at kin selection. And so the only reason that those traits can evolve is by virtue of the fact that the groups, as defined in the model, differentially contribute to the total population. And the reason that it wasn't obvious is that evolutionary change is monitored at the global level, what evolves at the end of the day. And even though the groups were present in those models,
We didn't look inside those groups to make a comparison between what's going on at the local level and what goes on at the global level. All you have to do is open up the hood of your own model and you will see multi-level selection. And so there's no alternative to this fundamental problem. If it is the case that there's this trade-off between within-group selection and between-group selection, then there's no alternative to the advantage at a larger scale to compensate for the disadvantage at a lower scale. And so we end up with tremendous unity and simplification for our evolutionary theories of social behavior. Really, there's just one theory that we need in order to do this. And there's multiple perspectives. It might be the case that inclusive fitness theory is better in some sense in terms of achieving a particular form of insight. This gets into philosophical ground about pluralism. When do we need multiple perspectives? And often we do, but that doesn't mean that they're just totally different causal stories. Okay, well, I want to give you a reality check here. It's so abstract, I have to give you this one real-world example of multiple selection. This is based on the work of Omar Eldekar, my former PhD student who's now at the University of Arizona. It has to do with these wonderful features here. These are water striders. Go to any quiet pool and you'll see them. They're gliding along the surface of the pond. The predators, they grab insects that have fallen into the pond. The dots are paint dots. It's not their actual coloration. And it turns out that there's huge individual differences in how the males respond to females. This is a big topic in evolution, by the way, sexual conflict. But some of the males are gentlemen, they just wait to be asked to perform their manly duty. And other males are just psychopaths, they're just predatory. They're on the hunt for females, and when they find one, they frankly just attempt to rape them. Is the only way that you can describe it in human terms. And the females do everything they can to lead. And so here we have an individual difference that we need to explain. Why do they coexist? And the first thing that Omar did was he created a number of pools, all had 6 males and 6 females, and he altered the composition of males to be all psychopaths, all gentlemen, and everything in between. And what he discovered was just a straight up advantage for psychopathy. That shouldn't work. Bad boys got the girl. And there was no advantage to being docile at the local scale. Right? But if you look between groups, what he found was that the group with all gentlemen produced 3 times as many babies as the groups with all psychopaths. Because the psychopaths were terrorizing the females. They couldn't eat, they couldn't lay eggs, they couldn't do any of that stuff. It was death. Important. And so there was the between group level was favoring docility in the same way that the within group level was favoring aggressiveness. What a wonderful example of multi-level selection. A trait which is selectively disadvantageous at the local scale, but advantageous with one layer up of groups of 6 individuals. And when you look all things considered, what you find is the difference between the lower graph and the upper graph is the difference that we owe to the differential productivity of groups. And you want to know, how does the variation among groups exist in this particular example? In chem selection, the reason the groups vary is because the individuals are genealogically related to each other. In this example, it's not genealogically related. So it's based on the movement of the females. Is that when you allow females to move between groups, and the females leave groups in which they're psychopathic males, and they concentrate in groups with docile males, and the psychopaths are free to follow, but it all settled down to an equilibrium where there's a considerable degree of clustering. And that gives you the variation among groups. Counter. Not entirely, and you end up with a mix. So here's a summary. Nice traits can evolve in nature despite being vulnerable and nasty traits in their immediate vicinity. They evolve only by virtue of a selective advantage on a larger scale. A clustering mechanism is required for between-group selection to prevail against within-group selection. In the case of water striders, the clustering is based on conditional movement. Think of that about humans, basically, about how nice people might survive by finding other nice people, despite being vulnerable to not so nice people in their vicinity. The clustering can exist for other reasons, in fact, numerous other reasons. But what's important is the clustering. And so there's more to this than kin selection. Kin selection is one kind of clustering. There's other kinds of clustering. And the end result is often a mix. Not a triumph or altruism or selfishness, but a coexistence of the two types. Not the kind of coexistence where we say it's good for the group to have both types. No, it would be good for the group for everyone to be altruistic. It's a different kind of coexistence. And is this beginning to sound a bit human? Might we say ideas apply to human social interaction? Okay, so now with a major evolutionary transition, so what this means is that the balance between levels of selection is not static, but can itself evolve. And so when mechanisms evolve that suppress selection within groups and cause between group selection to become the dominant evolutionary force, then the group becomes so cooperative that it becomes a higher level organism in its own right. And this was the first version of this theory was Lynn Margulis and her symbiotic self theory, which I think many, but not all of you are familiar with. She proposed that nucleated cells, eukaryotic cells, do not evolve by mutational steps from bacterial cells, but as symbiotic associations of bacteria, so basically communities of bacteria, different species in this case, evolved to be so cooperative that they became a new higher level organism. And then that was generalized only in the 1990s by John Maynard Smith and Louis Sloan, a Hungarian theoretical biologist, to explain other major transitions. Possibly even the origin of life arose as groups of cooperating molecular reactions. So life could have begun as cooperative groups, which I think is a charming metaphor, even if it's not true. Then the first cells, the first nucleated cells, multicellular organisms. You might think that multicellularity is easy to evolve because if there's a single cell stage, then the organism is genetically uniform. Right? No, that's not true at all. With every cell division, there's mutation and genetic diversity regenerating itself within each and every organism. And in a long-lived multicellular organism, and selection starts to take place within the organism, favoring cell types and genes which are spreading at the expense of others and are not good. We call that cancer. And that evolution taking place within the organism. So actually, the evolution of multicellular organisms is not easy. In social insect quality, same thing. And what's new, only within the last 10 or 15 years, so we can begin to think of our own thesis in this way. Both the genetic evolution of small-scale human sociology, and then the biocultural evolution of large-scale human sociology. And so what this means is that we're beginning to think about a single theoretical framework that can explain all of these different levels of functional organization. Things that we now recognize as individuals, but they turn out to be highly cooperative groups. But so the whole concept of individual and society, which is, of course, philosophical material all the way centuries old, the whole concept of individual and society literally emerged from individuals, nothing more, literally, not figuratively, literally as a highly regulated, highly cooperative group. All the way up to the social insects, and then to small-scale human groups, and then large-scale human groups such as the city. You can ask, is the city an organism or not? And if it's not, should it be? How can we get it to be more like an organism? Or so how this moves into the direction of policies. So let me fast forward a little bit here. Although it's interesting material. One of the points about this, what is needed for a major transition is social control. The only way that it can happen is to, it happens for pre and a clonal group. So if in fact there's no genetic diversity within the group, then we expect extreme cooperation and altruism simply because they're members of the group are genetically committed. In any other situation, there is a potential for within group selection. And the only way that you can have a major transition, if mechanisms evolve to suppress selection within groups so that between group selection can be the main evolutionary force. And humans, that's basically our moral psychology. That's the fact that we have these sort of psychological mechanisms that evolve, which cause us to be concerned with what you do, to make sure that you do it, for us to have norms, to enforce those norms. This is the kind of equipment that we use every moment of the day, but it's what causes us to function well as small groups, and what caused us to be so cooperative throughout our history. And then another piece, which I just have to go through so fast, is the concept of symbolic thought as an inheritance system. This is a very important book, Evolution in Four Dimensions, and what it establishes is something we should always have known, is that evolution is not about genes. Evolution is about heredity. That's the evolution that Darwin knew nothing about genes. If there's a resemblance between parents and offspring for any reason, then evolution can take place. And so evolution, this includes many professional evolutionists, many of my own colleagues in biological evolution, are excessively gene-centric. They think that evolution means genetic evolution. And what this book is disabuses you with that fact and shows that there are other mechanisms of inheritance. Epigenetics, fascinating topic, social learning, of course, but in humans, symbolic thought. So much of what we do is based on our meaning systems, our symbolic meaning systems. And symbolic thought has the same combinatorial diversity as genetic evolution. In a sexually reproducing organism, there's almost an infinite number of genotypes, each one with a phenotype. And so also, in humans, there could be almost an infinite number of meaning systems, symbolic systems, imagined worlds. A symbotype is one thing that we can call it. And each symbotype produces a phenotype that can be subject to evolution. So this gets you thinking about culture as a form of evolution. This is the way most people have been thinking for most of the 20th century. They're polarized. On one side we have biology, evolution, genes, genetic determinism, all of which leads to a sense that there's an incapacity for change over the time scale that matters. And that's why it's threatening. That's why people are threatened by genetic determinism, is that it seems to lead to an incapacity for change. Evolution means an incapacity for change in the minds of many people. Now, on the other side, we have learning and culture. Somehow that leads to a capacity for change, and somehow we can think of it without consulting evolution. This is outside the orbit of evolution in the minds of many people. That's the way it's been projected. And what we've done, of course, is we've brought this basically inside the orbit of evolutionary theory. Yes, indeed, we have an impressive, not limited, flip-and-book capacity for open-ended change. This capacity is a sophisticated process of genetic evolution. The immune system is a really good way of thinking about this. Our capacity for behavioral and cultural change is like the immune system, and just as complex. And if we don't understand the mechanisms behind our behavioral and cultural change, we're going to be no better able to manage it than if we don't understand the mechanisms of the immune system. That's an excellent metaphor. So basically, what we've done is we've taken open-ended learning and culture. We've not denied it. We've acknowledged that it's important. But now we're saying the best way to understand it inside the orbit of evolutionary theory. Okay, so I'm going to go a couple more minutes, and then I'm going to take those 5 minutes to question. And so we have the ancestral social environment. This has been said, but it's profoundly true, I think. It's something that we all need to keep in mind, that the natural human social environment is the small group environment. If we want to understand how we tick as a species, then we need to understand how we function in small groups. And whenever we can have small groups in modern life, whenever we can do something through small groups in modern life, then we want to do so. And this evolutionary conclusion is highly conciliant with this person you know well, many of you do. She was here a couple years ago. Eleanor Ostrom, the classic work that's been done out here on offshore fishermen, very much in the same paradigm, is very conciliant with this kind of small group psychology. And if you look at Eleanor Ostrom's work,
She did primarily on common pool resource groups. And what she showed, both theoretically and especially empirically, is that the groups are capable of managing their own affairs, but only if certain conditions are met, which she empirically drew up. And if you look at these conditions, what you can see is that they're very conciliant with what you would conclude based on the evolutionary dynamics of cooperation and the biocultural evolution of our own species. And they provide a tremendously practical how-to guide for helping groups function well in a modern context. And now I am feeling a little rushed, but two fascinating things about this list are, one, very straightforward, no surprises, very intuitive to read down that list, and of course that would make groups function well. Number two, groups don't automatically adopt them. Many groups that do not adopt these design features. And it's for that reason that we can begin in the first place to generalize these core design features. And I'm privileged to work with Lynn Ostrom and her group to take these design features that she worked out for a particular kind of group in a particular kind of context, and to show that actually we can use this for just about any kind of group with a common purpose, and that we can use this as a coaching tool and a coordination tool. At the same time that we assemble a database, in the same way that she assembled a database of common pool resources, we can develop a platform for working with groups, improving their efficacy, studying them all in one single framework. So that's one of the things that we're doing. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, for those who can stay, is I'm going to show how we were able to use these principles, plus some other evolutionary principles, to make a particular group work well. It is a program for undergraduate high school students. So in the rest of my talk, I'm going to move into the practical realm. I'm going to show how we succeeded in making one group better, and then talk a little bit about economics and large-scale human social organization. But let me stop now just to give some people a chance to leave and take a few questions before we continue. This is like the intermission at the drive-in movie. Actually, we can't get more at the questions.
In terms of communication, started off talking about the National Academy had 2 or 3 years ago developed the curriculum. Great. Our argument is that these people simply have time to absorb that line of information and great. Everything else is not coming out. So how do you get these relations
Right, and that's a great question. And as you know, the field of evolutionary medicine is about 20 years old. And we're actually working with Randy Netsy. We have a workshop in May on this topic. And I think the answer, which I'll bet is your answer, is that learning becomes so much more efficacious when you have a conceptual framework to hand you. And so if you have a bunch of stuff to learn, and if you don't provide some kind of scaffold in order to hang things on, learning will be difficult and will not be very successful. If you actually have a scaffold, and many scaffolds can do, then you can accomplish the job of learning a ton of stuff better than without that scaffold. And I think that's actually true. One of the things in my experience teaching evolution across the curriculum, I have anecdotal examples, and now we're getting systematic evidence. But many, and this is also true for myself, a student will say, I was an average student before I got this evolution stuff. And as soon as I got turned on to evolution, I became an A student. And I became an A student in all my courses, my history courses. So if that's true, what happened? And what happened is that when you were sitting in the average class and all this stuff was being ground mastered, what was going to stick? And if you have a framework that causes things to stick, then that will solve your problem. Won't make it work. And although there's many frameworks that can be used, lots of different kinds of interdisciplinarity, I think an argument can be made. It sounds imperialistic. I don't think it is. I think it's just actually there's an argument to be made that actually evolution is the best scaffold for hanging. How else is it possible that I, as a biologist, would study religion, a topic that many people spend their whole lives studying, and which I do nothing about, not even any personal experience to speak of? I could wander into the field of religious studies and actually have something worth saying if I wasn't bringing something with me, and that something was this toolkit, this conceptual framework or something. So I think that's the best answer to this. A couple more questions and then.
Evolution of territoriality, would it get, you never mentioned that, but it seems like, the general trend would be towards more cooperative and more interactive society with less aggression and with multi-level selection. And yet we have quite a few solitary issues Does it mean that within the group selection case where only much stronger than within the group selection?
Well, territoriality, a question like that, you would have to look at particular species in relation to their particular environments. And there's many solitary species. There's many solitary insect species. There's many solitary wasps, for example. And so depending on the nature of the resources, it might be that just functioning by yourself is simply better than functioning as a group. By the way, that also applies to human life. I can lift my watch very well by myself. Thank you very much. If you tried to help, it would only get in the way. If I have to move this podium, it's a different matter. Even complex tasks like playing the violin. Please don't try to help me play the violin. That's complex, but it's still something that's done by an individual. And so these things have to be settled on a task-by-task environment basis. But let me tell you one story in which territoriality is bad to the group. It is a case where within group selection one, and it was detrimental to the group. And this is what often happens on endangered species of birds. Let us say that they're on a small island. And for them to persist as a population, the breeding population should be as large as possible. That's best accomplished by having either small territories or no territories at all. Okay. So for the good of the group or the species, territoriality, and especially large territories, would be a bad thing. Nevertheless, within that island, the individuals with the largest territory have the most kids that are relatives in. And so large territory size does evolve on those small islands. And as a result, those species do go extinct faster than they would otherwise. So evolution takes you where you don't want to go. That's called evolutionary suicide in evolution.
Would small territories provide enough resources?
Maybe not, but basically, so again, that would have to be answered by knowing a lot about that particular species and that particular place. But the information I've provided does give an example of how something can evolve. Evolution, and we have many examples of this. Evolution's causing species to become specialized in a way that's going to be a dead end down the road. And so the idea that evolution is an adaptation is actually creating dysfunction at some other scale is one of the elementary things that we need.
Thank you.
And one more, and then I'm going to dash through the rest of my talk.
This is actually kind of a related question with territoriality. It's thinking about territoriality or inter-individual competition at the different scales. When we think about one of the major products of natural selection is the production of more competitive units. And so that if we're talking about selection at the gene level, it's those that do better in relation to others. If we talk about it at the individual level, that's more for individual conflict and competition. And then presumably, as we talk about it at the group level or time order level producing groups that tend to be better competitors with other groups. So that
Totally.
intergroup individual conflict would
So
actually
it's
increase.
important, so in order to tackle this subject, we have to do a couple of things. First of all, remember Darwin said that evolution is not always nature met a true law. Sometimes it's a matter of plants competing against the desert, right? And so one form of group selection, just as with individuals, is that groups can evolve by group selection simply by functioning well as groups, without any form of direct between-group competition. Having said that, direct between-group competition has been used in evolution, and how far back it's been used is actually a big bone of contention. You know, has it been the case that the small hunter-gatherer groups all the way back were intense or not? So, but speaking of cultural evolution, my colleague Peter Turchin at the University of Connecticut, who's also the vice president of the Evolution Institute, has a book called War and Peace and War. And it is a theory of the rise and fall of empires. And what this theory says very briefly is that when empires form, it's in geographical regions of intense between-group conflict, often at the border of major ethnic zones. And so these groups have been locked in between-group conflict, these cultures, for sometimes centuries. And it acts as a crucible for the evolution of extremely cooperative society. And when this happens, that culture expands into an empire. There's your empire. So what happens next? What happens next is that cultural evolution takes place within the empire, selecting for self-serving behaviors, factionalism in all their forms, and within group selection causes this entity, this cooperative entity that formed, to dissolve. And then the cycle begins again at some other frontier, never at the center of an old empire, always at a new frontier. So it's actually a multi-level cultural evolutionary story of the rise and fall of these empires. And if you look at the cultural history of the European nation, why is it that you go far enough back and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of city-states, and then you got these coalescing events? That was pretty well predominantly based on warfare and the economic competition that underlies warfare. So you've got to appreciate the importance of direct between-group selection, but you also got to appreciate Darwin's point about plants competing against the desert. Well, let me zip through this. This is now back to the small-scale program for at-risk youth. It's published, so I can go through the details. What we tried to do is we tried to design this program to embody the Ostrom design principles. You can ask your question, think of your school experience, or think of the experience of school from the eyes of an at-risk student, and ask how many of these design features would describe their school experience. And the answer is lots of them. Just tons. I won't go into the details, but just to focus on one, local autonomy. For the average school group, actually classroom, or even a whole school, is it free to do things this way? Often not. Often they're locked into a single way of doing things, and they do not have the discretion to do the stuff even if they know that they would do. There's just one. There's some other evolutionary principles. One is, very simple, is that all species, including humans, function psychologically very different in a safe and secure environment versus a fear-inducing environment. And if you want learning to take place, other than the most narrow form of learning to escape your immediate situation or solve your particular problem, you need to cultivate a safe and secure environment, not a fearful environment. Simple, and yet how many times doesn't it happen? And then there's this, that any species learning will not take place if all the costs are in the present and all the benefits are in the future. No species learns that way. And so if you want long-term learning goals to be achieved, you've got to make it rewarding over the short term. This is a book by Binghamton, who's most famous for his work on flow, peak psychological experience. And in this book, he followed a cohort of teenagers that were identified as gifted in the 9th grade. He followed them through their high school career. And he asked how many had fulfilled their gifts, remained gifted in the 12th grade, how many of them have become nearly average.
And the main answer to the question was the kids that were fulfilling their gifts were the ones who enjoyed what they were doing on a day-to-day basis. They liked it. And because they liked it on a day-to-day basis, that's why they kept it up. And if you're told that you're gifted in math or science and that you could have a great career as a mathematician or scientist, but you don't like it, you're not going to keep it up. And if that's true for the gifted kids, it's going to be doubly true for the at-risk kids. And so we did a very simple thing. Let's try to make school as fun as possible so they want to go to school. So we did a randomized, and how many school policies explicitly don't do that? They say, well, you're not learning the 3 R's, so therefore we'll take away the fun stuff, we'll hold your nose to the grindstone until you learn the 3 R's. A general point to make is that every policy has a rationale, otherwise we wouldn't do it. So every policy that we try to implement has a surface logic. Otherwise we wouldn't be tempted to do it. But like the wishes made in folktales, often there are unforeseen consequences. And typically we don't have a way of tracking the unforeseen consequences. So we do something, and then shit happens, excuse me, and we have no way to trace it back to its source. Things like no touch rules in school are like that. We don't want sexual harassment, we prohibit people from touching each other, and we've forgotten about the fact that we're mammals. And the way we communicate trust and safety is by touching each other. Age segregation is another example. We think it's efficient to organize kids in the same age groups, so we didn't realize that in any culture, indigenous culture, learning takes place in mixed age groups. So kids learn from older kids. They don't learn from adults. They learn from older kids, and they do it much more spontaneously. And then mixed age interactions brings out nurturance, and same age interactions brings out competition. You put a 14-year-old with another 14-year-old, we know what happens. If you put a 14-year-old with 18-year-old and 8-year-old, something else happens. And so we create pathological social environments that any fool could see isn't going to work, but only against the background of certain assumptions. Everything depends on the background of certain assumptions. And what evolution often encourages you to do for a topic such as education is to ask a simple question, such as, how does cultural transmission take place in hunter-gatherer societies? Those folks have a tremendous amount that needs to be learned and taught. Much more than we do as individuals. How is all that information transmitted across generations in hunter-gatherer societies? And the answer is in a way in which nothing much resembles formal education. And your average educator would never even dream of making that comparison. That's the sense in which this evolutionary perspective, and this in many other ways, is acting as a kind of a game changer by just changing the frame of these comparisons. So of course we wanted to do good science. We did a randomized control trial. We admitted twice as many students to the program. We had to flunk 3 more courses to get into our program the previous year. We identify 120 of those folks, we take in 60, the other 60 go right back into the high school so that we can do a proper randomized control trial. And the results are this. So we created a social environment in which we stacked the deck in favor of pro-sociality, cooperative outcomes. And what we find is that the students in the academy, they start doing better immediately. By the first quarter, they popped up like a cork, and they're functioning better than in the normal high school environment. Yeah.
But is the group size the same? You know, kids who are back in the high school are made in a high school with tons of kids, and Regents kids are in smaller groups.
So group size might be one of the ingredients, right? And we want to do a component analysis. What we did was we put together the best package we could think of. And first we want to make sure that the package does better than the other package. And after we know that, then we can take that package apart. Okay? And so this says that our package is working better than the other package. But whether it's group size or something else, it has more work. Okay? But what we can say is that these kids who've got very hard lives, these kids would break their hearts if you heard their stories.
and their lives remain harsh in every other respect except when they're in school. Nothing else has changed, but they still have the resilience to respond like chameleons to their social environment, improve the social environment, and they respond within the first market period. Now, the best test was the state mandated exams, but that's the exact same test taken by everyone. What this shows is that not only did the Regents Academy students blow the comparison group away for 4 subject areas, but the Regents Academy students performed on a par with the average high school student. With the average high school student. And you can also look at non-academic variables. Family, well-being. So this is bleeding over basically to just their general well-being. So basically what we're doing in the schools, we're trying to also do in the neighborhoods, and I really do want to finish up here. But here's the point. What we're doing in the city of Binghamton is conceptually identical to what my student Omar Eldikar did for Water Strike. We're measuring individual differences in pro-sociality. And you might ask, is that easy or hard? There's a whole set of interesting questions. But actually, it's not hard to measure individual differences in pro-sociality. And the differences among us are huge. The low end of the bell curve is not in this room. And most of you are pretty pro-social. And if I were to give you a survey, you'd indicate such. And you might say that you're a selfish altruist and interested in illnesses like that. But the fact is there's an enormous difference in the degree to which people are going to work on behalf of others and their society as a whole, as opposed to the conflict. So you can take these individual differences and you can then geocode them basically, so that you can look at where they live geographically, and you can generate maps like this, which is so evocative. Here's my city of Binghamton, and those dark areas are regions with a high concentration of highly pro-social teenagers and kids, and the light areas are the areas which are deserts for pro-sociality. We can go on from there, but again, because my time with you is short, one reason I like to show this graph to a biologically oriented audience is it doesn't look like a plant distribution map. Doesn't it look like the distribution and abundance? That's an ecological term. And what this is about is basically considering alternative human social strategy as in a Darwinian context. And so most of us have the capacity to be either pro-social or not. There might be genetic differences. There are genetic differences in our specific propensities and specific patterns, but almost all of us have the capacity to be either pro-social or not, which either is facilitated or inhibited throughout development, and that we retain the capacity to different degrees in various parts of our life cycle. But at the end of the day, whether we behave in a pro-social fashion or a non-pro-social fashion is going to be based on how they fare as social strategies in a Darwinian context. And if we know that, and if we can appreciate that, then we can change the social environment, and we can cause the whole city to be more dark than it is. And it's not just a matter of space, it's a matter of social relationships, and so on. So I think that, yeah, okay, so, finishing up. Still a few minutes. So here's the first fundamental theorem of multi-level selection theory. I'd like to juxtapose it, which is what is literally called the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics in the most recent dictionary of economics, which is laissez-faire leads to the common good. This is the briefest way that I can communicate a paradigmatic difference between this biological way of looking at this, which is represented by MLS theory, and one tradition in economics. Economics is as diverse as biology, but the one tradition, and the currently dominant tradition, is somehow built around the central metaphor that of the invisible hand, basically, is that individual choices and giving people the capacity to make individual choices results
in a well-functioning society. And then if we try to regulate that, we'll make it worse. Okay? And it's much more complicated than that, but this is a paradigmatic difference. And so we've been actually very respectfully and seriously rethinking economics, collaboration with the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, NESA, and it's resulting in a special issue of this well-respected journal, QVO. The title of the special issue is Evolution as a General Theoretical Framework for Economics and Public Policy. You guys are very respectful. It says every branch of economics and every discipline in the social sciences has had its encounter with evolutionary theory. You really have to be good social historians to understand how it's possible that there was Darwin's theory, such an impact. Every human-related discipline had its encounter with it, and in so many cases it caused them to go off in all of these different directions. And so whatever they think about evolution, however evolution is represented within their framework, it is not the same as what biologists do, what evolutionary biologists do when they employ evolution. And what the purpose of the special issue is to actually accomplish that transformation so that we're using evolution to study economics and public policy in the same way that biologists use it to study the rest of life. And the lead article for this special issue, which is still under construction, is available on the Evolution Institute website. So if you want to learn more, please go to that. So I'm done at last. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Dr. Wilson, and obviously you were able to retain a large fraction of the audience well past so I think there's some success here. And so considering the fact that people are still sitting down, it looks like we have opportunity for further questions. So dig in.
Now, I maintain excellent eye contact with you.
Made me think about some research that I'm considering, and it has to do with, I'm from a toxicologist.
Okay.
And so organisms and populations of fish like this develop resistance to mercury. So now I'm thinking, how do I think about the implications of that for the other organisms in that ecosystem?
Right.
You know, I mean, I can think of the immediate consequences if the organism survives both mercury, like a toxic package and birds to eat it. But that's the way I've thought in a very limited way.
I think you're in the right place. I'm hard to remember your name. Who's the person I talked about?
Krista? Did she just know? Yeah.
Krista does exactly that. She did it with this introduced species of fish, the aquarium fish. What is it?
Armored catfish.
These are the ones that you have your algae eaters, right? And so these algae eaters, which are so dominant in the aquarium trade, they've been really everywhere, and they become huge pests, and they transform the ecosystem. But get this, they eat dirt. It's not like a predator that you release, it's something where the effect would be somewhat obvious. Whatever effect they're having on the ecosystem is some indirect effect. And so this is happening again and again, that a single species that gets in there is, or it doesn't have to be a single species, it could be a native species like white-tailed deer. But the point is that an ecosystem is a complex system, and it will have such things as tipping points. And different basins of attraction, where if you knock it out of one orbit into another, and the fisheries industry is all about this too, that you can, when you exploit a species, a little bit, and then you stop, it pops back. But if you do it too much, the whole system goes to some other place, and if you relax the pressure, it doesn't go back. And that's a property of complex systems. And one point to make, it's not a theme of this talk, but basically, the whole topic of complex systems is as important as the topic of evolution, because it's always the evolution of complex systems and complex environments
right? And so they need to be done in conjunction with each other. So studying evolution without complexity, complexity without evolution is inadequate. We need to be studying the evolution of complex systems and complex environments, which is, of course, complex.
One of the things I forgot to mention when I introduced Dr. Wilson is that he's hosted in large part by the Sustainability Solutions Initiative. And so, and as we've seen, the work he's doing in Binghamton is, of course, very much related to the work that we're trying to do with SSI. And so, particularly if there are any comments that are trying to understand how to apply this stuff, this is something that I'm trying to wrestle with as well. You know, how do we work on taking multi-level selection theory as it relates to human cooperation, pro-social behavior, pro-environmental behaviors, and apply that to the development of sustainability. If you have questions that are related to, along that line, that's the sort of bigger question I'm going to be asking over the next 3 days.
Let me take the two in that direction. Yes?
I think you're first.
Well, it seems to me like there's a dark side to these social groups as well in terms of xenophobia and defining a group often defines itself as what it's not, and those who are outside that group. And so I can see that happening with your high school students potentially. How do you address that, or how do you prevent that sort of negative side from forming a group? And can a group ever coalesce to the level so that everybody is in one group without outsiders?
Yeah, so great questions, and of course, all big questions deserve big answers, which I'm not in a position to give, but there's a few important points to make. One is that a theory is a good theory in an explanatory sense, and it has to explain the existence of between-group conflict. It's out there, it happened, and if our theory said it didn't happen, then that would be a false theory. Then a good theory needs to manage something which is a problem from a policy sense, and we certainly want to manage between-group conflict. What the data tells us, which I think is affirming, and that is that within group solidarity and between group conflict are only loosely connected to each other. And so it's possible to cultivate a strong sense of within group solidarity without necessarily generating between group conflict. But of course, there's a kind of a hair trigger. And you can actually do just that if you're not careful. And so what that means is that you have to manage competition. And you have to make it a friendly competition or a soft competition. And this is done all the time in sports. So in one of these, a school program, which is one of the best validated school programs ever, it's now decades old, it's called the Good Behavior Game. And what it consists of is splitting the class into groups which compete to be good. And there's mechanisms to prevent such things as ostracism within the group, that you scramble the membership of the groups, for example. There's other kind of bells and whistles. But the fact is, as soon as you set up this soft competition and they compete to be good, then peer pressure turns into reinforcing good behavior rather than bad behavior. Another thing that they've discovered is that there's a huge range in the quality of the science. So much is done without any validation at all. But then there's some stuff that's just the best validated ever. And so finding the great studies is a thrill, basically. One of these lines of research shows that if you want to help at-risk kids, and so you identify a bunch, you bring them together, and you do some kind of counseling, actually what you've done is you've made it worse. Because they're reinforcing each other's values more than anything that you're trying to teach them. And this has become known as deviance training. And there's many, many programs that have run aground on the fact that, of course, like the wishes of folk tales, you want to help these kids, but bring them together, except when you study what happened. And then you don't want to do that. You want to be more clever than that. And so in that sense, I think that when you are that clever, then you can utilize the power of group psychology and avoid the negative side effects. But it is like playing with fire.
In response to Tim's charge to the audience, I actually had a related question that fits, and it was started out as one line in my notebook in the beginning of your talk, and evolved into 3/4 of a page now. So, but I'll go back to the simple version. I was in a ecology seminar back in graduate school and a long time ago, and one of the questions that was put on the table was, what influences the trajectory of science in ecology? And one of the students was adamant that it was always where the funding went, and that the blips that you would see if you Google different concepts now relate to what funding came on the scene, who responded to the papers that were funded, and it shows this large blip in the history of ecology. And I'm wondering if you evaluated ecology and academics related to that as a system, a super system, how do external forces, say NSF, or what the example that was brought up in that class was that Odom had a lot of influence from the nuclear science groups, and so he had a big footprint on how ecology went forward, but was based on another interest. So I'm wondering if that superorganism is just being pushed around, and then you have to. I'm just curious about the external forces that influence that.
Yeah, another great question, and the little bit I'll play off of there is that Skinner, B.F. Skinner, was dominant in his day, but then was kind of rejected within mainstream academic psychology. He never went away. He's always been hugely influential in the applied behavioral sciences. But if you go back and read it, all of these traditions are babies in bathwater. So there was definitely a lot of bathwater in what Skinner said, but there was also a big healthy baby in what he said. And in a famous paper of his called Selection by Consequences, he basically said that the learned operant conditioning is an evolutionary process that evolved by genetic evolution. At the end of the day, we are selected by consequences. And so we are, in many ways, some we're conscious of, some we're unconscious of. We're basically bending towards the incentives that are placed around us. And if you put that in an academic setting, then what you find is that whole fields can be selected by consequences. And whether those are benign consequences or not is, we just have to see. But back to multi-level selection. If you're selected for one thing, don't expect it to serve another purpose well. And in many, many cases of academic disciplines and research programs which just basically ended up chasing grants and getting really good at it, and being not good at other things. And those disciplines result in incapacity to actually respond to things. I'll give you an example of that, which is really memorable. And it's actually in my book, The Neighborhood Project, but I was invited to a conference for a society called the Society of Prevention Science, which I'd never heard of before. How many of you have heard of the Society of the Field of Prevention Science? Go figure, right? So, and this is a session on prevention science from an evolutionary perspective, lively session, a dozen speakers, an audience of 75, and two people from NIH and NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Awareness, where these folks get most of their money. Okay, and a lot of these folks are soft money folks, right? And so here are these grants officers that are there to listen to this new stuff, and they were asked the question, is this something that your agency might fund? And I'll always remember, this woman said, well, it's not very interesting, but I don't think you should use the word evolution because, and it was not because she thought that the reviewers were hostile to evolution. Any academic is going to say that they believe it. This is not a problem of creation. It was just that it was sufficiently out of the box that a grant that was framed that way would not sail in that system. So the system had become part of the problem. And that's just, there would be many other ways to respond to your question. But if you looked at it in an economic system, corporations that are maximizing their bottom line, and how that works with respect to the larger system, that to me is the sobering message about the fact that the first fundamental theory that adaptation at a given level requires selection at that level. So if you want something to work, you have to select for that thing. And if you select for something else, then you've got to be very, very careful on how that's connected. Very often,
you're going to come up against that trade-off problem. And it's the very fact that that's where your knowledge became part of your problem. And that's certainly just as much for academic disciplines as for any other entity. A lot of this turns in some of the conversations we're having with the SSI has to do with how do we, because this is such an interdisciplinary operation, how do we make our academic groups work? How do we make this work as an academic enterprise when these people are coming from all the different directions and their disciplines and so on and so on? So just solving the problem of creating the group that addresses sustainability issues is something where you have to turn the theory upon that in order to do that.
So in terms of trying to apply all these ideas to create certain behaviors, it seems to me that the way that you presented it here, you're working at two levels of causation at the exact same time. And I wonder if different types of applications might be more successful under one scale versus another where they're both important. And the two scales would be either the actual selection, so where you're actually trying to create an engine for cultural evolution to create a desired outcome, artificial selection on cultural behavior, cultural means, versus trying to use a phylogenetic framework and saying we are creatures that have evolved in a certain framework and we need to take advantage of small groups and social learning and multi-age and all those sorts of things. But those are two different things. And when we're trying to apply this knowledge to create neighborhoods or classrooms or what have you, do you have a feel for whether is it necessary to think about the actual cultural evolution in situ, or can we just think of it in terms of more from like an evolutionary psychologist framework and say that, hey, this is the way we are, and that works for good enough on short time scales? Or
Yeah, what a great question. And so the little thing that I can say about that, actually there's three little things I want to say about that. One is that if you actually learn enough scientifically about what makes a group work, you can just design a group. And we're starting to do that. Sloan is one example, but we're working very hard with Eleanor Roster and with these prevention science folks to create an ambitious framework where we can basically coach any group. There'll be an internet platform so that any group can join. And the resources provided will kind of walk you through the design features in a systematic way, with data for us, so that we can actually start giving you a checkup. And then inform goals and all this kind of thing, revisit them and all that. There'll also be a network of real-world coaches that's drawn from this prevention science community. That's pretty awesome. And so there's a sense in which we're kind of explicitly designing the group. But that said, one of the main imports of Eleanor Ostrom's work is that each group is actively evolving in its own right. So in some ways what you want to do is you want to rely upon variation selection. And you want to set up, manage cultural evolutionary process in which you let 1,000 flowers bloom. And then you pick the flower and you spread the flower. And another point to make is that even though there's something top-down about setting all that in motion, the solution can often be bottom-up. And so it's not as if this results in big government and that kind of information. Very often, it turns out that the conservatives were right about that, and that the state or the nation or so on was not in a position to regulate what was going on the ground. That was too complex, too localized, all of that kind of stuff. And what you needed to do was to create appropriately sized units. And that was the best way to do it. And the final point I'll make is that again and again and again, what you find is that what happens roughly spontaneously at a small scale will not happen at all at a large scale unless you actually create some cultural things in order for it to happen. So in a small group, it just happens more or less automatically that we look around, we see what works. What we need to do is pretty self-evident. We have our little rules of thumb about respectful people and so on and so forth. And the process of cultural evolution at a small scale is something that we were more or less adapted to do as a species, and it not always, but often just kind of runs itself.
when you contemplate the same thing working at a larger scale, you're in a situation where it's just not what we were adapted to do. And so therefore, you have to build it in. You have to facilitate the variation. You have to facilitate the selection. And part of that is just an examination of best practices, for example. So if something works in Seattle, I know about it and I can think of implementing it here. I don't know if it'll work there, but for the 1,000 flowers, there's like flowers that are blooming in my city, and then there's the flowers that are blooming elsewhere. If I want to include those flowers, I have to do work in order to find them. And I have to do work in order for my community to want to select them. So there's all this cultural work that has to be done in order for it to work. And that's just our lot, basically, is we have to create this infrastructure. And that infrastructure has to have the higher level functionality in mind, but at the end of the day, it does not resemble top-down government. Need not. So it's an intriguing blend of liberal and conservative principles. It doesn't fall into any camp, and that's a good thing. So this is not liberal or conservative. It's new. So I think that's an extremely important thing to do.
Thank you. I haven't taken the food away yet, and I won't take him away yet for a while. So make sure to take it.